Thank you very much, Kathy and Paul. And very conscious that I have the last slot of the day. I have 10 short slides on the feedback of incidental findings during the imaging pilot study. The first thing to emphasize is that the pilot's all about feasibility. It's the feasibility of the scientific protocols, and it's also the feasibility of the incidental findings protocol that we've actually put in place. Fundamentally, is it reasonable? Does it work? I've also taken the opportunity to define incidental findings right at the outset, which is simply as findings observed during the imaging assessment visit which are incidental to its purposes. We have an existing feedback policy. We recruited 500,000 participants between 2007 and 2010, as you know, on the basis of this policy to which they consented. And there are three forms of feedback within that policy, these forms are often conflated in the literature. The first of which is the routine reporting of certain selected measures. And this is simply things that would have been impractical to conceal from them, like their height, their weight, their BMI, and their blood pressure. Then there was the feedback of serious incidental findings that were observed during the visit. Now, these really were two common forms, one of which was evidence of domestic abuse, and the other was melanoma. And the third arm of our feedback policy is that there's no reporting back of findings from subsequent research. Now, we looked at this policy to see if it would work for the imaging assessment visit, and after extensive deliberation, we decided that there was no reason to change the policy itself, although we did appreciate that we needed a more detailed protocol on dealing with the incidental findings from imaging, simply because of their potential significance and frequency. So how do we actually develop the protocol itself? We had extensive discussions with other population-based imaging research projects, such as MISA, which was based in Johns Hopkins, the Icelandic Heart Study in Reykjavik, both of which were roughly 5,000 participants strong, and with the, as Paul alluded to, the SHIP study in Pomerania in Old East Germany, which is seen as a sort of somewhat of a forerunner to the upcoming German national cohort. We had an extensive dialogue with a number of leading clinicians with the Royal College of Radiologists, and they, in the meantime, published their very helpful guidance in 2010 about this subject, to which Paul alluded. Expert ethicists, our funders, the Wellcome Trust and the Medical Research Council, and also with our own independent Ethics and Governance Council. And also because the scope of the duty of care, which essentially underpins the sort of relationship that we need to have with the participants who come for the imaging assessment visit. We thought it would actually make sense to actually bottom this out in quite some detail. So we went to leading sort of clinical negligence council to actually establish what this would be. And he was very involved in the production of all the documentation that we've developed. If you look at the strategic factors that we actually took into account in developing the protocol, we looked at the nature of the research project that we were conducting and the number of participants, the actual protocols that we were going to run, the context of the participant visit, which is quite clearly it's in a non-clinical setting, and the information that we wanted to provide to participants, essentially to manage their expectations appropriately, so they had a very good idea of what they were going to visit and the sort of feedback they were going to receive. And I think the underlying principle that we've always tried to adopt here is a sort of do as you would be done by. In other words, we've tried to sort of do it so that it is genuinely reasonable, fair, and commensurate with what we're actually doing. Obviously, we looked at the likely nature of the serious incidental findings themselves. And also we tried to balance the potential benefits from feedback, which are the ones often quoted in literature, which are relatively straightforward if something is identified, which actually leads to a positive clinical outcome. But there are quite a lot of negative impacts from feedback as well. I mean, there's the false positives, which people have been alluding to, which take people down a road of biopsies and unnecessary anxiety. And there's also instances when things are lesions are correctly identified, but there's no specific treatment which is there, or the treatment which is there is actually rather ambiguous or contested. And this can lead to a number of quite practical problems for participants, such as their travel insurance being invalidated. So then we looked at the actual factors for us behind the protocol. So the participants were attending in this non-clinical setting in the coordinating centre in Cheadle. There's no specific research hypothesis involved. that we've tried to make the consent forms and information materials as explicit as we possibly can, including the use of sort of video materials on the website. The images are clearly taken for research, not diagnostic purposes. The frequency by which incidental findings are generated is very dependent on the area of the body being scanned. And I think our concerns always probably been more with the abdomen than anywhere else, where there's actually much less literature than as opposed to the head and the cardiac area. Public expectations about imaging often, really significantly exceed the diagnostic ability of the scans themselves. And I do that really from an entirely unscientific profile of some of my colleagues and friends who think that imaging is essentially as a sort of magic solution which leads to an entirely definitive diagnosis, and unfortunately the reality is not that. And then we took into account that feedback doesn't necessarily result in a positive outcome for participants, and also assessing the impact on the wider healthcare system. That's both the primary and the secondary healthcare system, because you can envisage a scenario where we have, in the main phase, we're aiming to have 100,000 participants being imaged. If we were generating incidental findings in 95,000 of those, it's easy to see that that's not really going to be particularly feasible. And what works for one study doesn't necessarily work for another. For example, SHIP in Pomerania in old East Germany had a system whereby 2 radiologists read every scan, and then if there was disagreement, it was reported to a third. Now, the reason they did that is because the inhabitants there were relatively poor, and they had no ready access to healthcare, and the numbers involved in the study were relatively small. Obviously, when you actually scale it up by a factor of 50, a lot of those factors don't necessarily apply. This is the protocol itself, and it's really there in three sentences, and it's designed around the fact it's what the radiographers observe. They observe something which they consider to be potentially serious, which we've tried to define in reasonable detail, and if that's what they consider, it's referred to the imaging centre radiographer, who then in turn refers it on to one of the specialist radiologists within that we've engaged to actually look at the scans. And I think the important thing to say here is that's what we consider to be the best and most appropriate protocol to adopt. It's not the only one. Another similar study could look at this and actually want to adopt a slightly different protocol, and I think that would be perfectly reasonable. But it's the one that, taking into account all the considerations that we have, we think is the most appropriate one to conduct the research that we need to conduct. Obviously, we're going to have to evaluate it and see if it is reasonable, fair, and feasible. And we're going to sort of evaluate the participants' understanding of the consent process that they went through. And then we'll do that by sending out a questionnaire after 6 weeks post their visit. And then for the ones that actually have serious incidental findings, we'll send out a subsequent questionnaire 6 months post-visit to see what's actually happened in the treatment of those findings. And lastly, we'll have a process of actually evaluating the protocol that we have devised by comparing it to, really for the first 1,000 participants, a system which is more common in smaller scale imaging projects whereby all the images are actually reviewed by radiologists. So we have our protocol, which is the one where the radiographers observe and in turn report, and the protocol that's sometimes employed in smaller scale studies where every single scan is read by radiologists. And I have asked Steve earlier this week for a rough cut of some of the numbers so far. So that they're a little bit behind Paul's, but they're about right. So there's 3,000 participants been invited, thousands have accepted. So we've got a sort of attendance rate of really over 33%, which is very encouraging. About 200 participants have been scanned so far. Paul said about 250 by the end of this week. And of those 200, about 170 of them have been reviewed by the radiologists so far. And if you then compare the radiologist review, what that has shown is that they've identified 30 potentially serious incidental findings, none in the head, 16 in the heart, 17 in the abdomen, and the reason they don't add up to 30 is that some participants present with more than one serious incidental finding, and the radiographer referral has actually led to 26 potentially serious findings being identified by the radiographers, 5 of which have been confirmed by the radiologists. I mean, the main thing to say about these two protocols is they're different and they will lead to different results. As I understand it, we've already had from the radiologist review a first example of a false positive coming through. So, and I'd really just like to thank all the people involved in developing this protocol. Started in 2009, and we're here in 2014, and it's very exciting to be able to commence the study. Thank you very much indeed.